Hey, welcome to another episode of GeekOutdoors.com. So today I'm going to be asking what happened to the Sega Saturn. So this is a game system that will forever live in infamy because this pretty much led to the end of Sega as a hardware manufacturer, because after this came out the Sega Dreamcast, and after that they were done with hardware. Now there are many reasons why this game system failed, so I'm going to be going over those reasons, but I'm also going to be going over my own experiences as well. Now, the Sega Saturn was released in Japan on November 22nd, 1994, and it sold really well. It actually sold like 200,000 units. And it sold that well mainly because of one game, and that was Virtua Fighter. So pretty much for every Saturn that was sold, a copy of Virtua Fighter was also sold as well. Now, even though this was really great for Sega at the beginning, a company who's never made a game system before also came out in Japan, and that game system was, of course, the Sony PlayStation. Now, initially, whenever the PlayStation was released, it wasn't beating the Sega Saturn in terms of sales. But over time, the PlayStation started outselling the Saturn, and that's when Sega got really nervous about its release in the US. Because initially, the plan was to release the Sega Saturn on Saturn Day. And Saturn Day was actually September 2nd, 1995. But because of the Sony PlayStation and it outselling the Sega Saturn, Sega of America was getting really scared and nervous, and so they did the unthinkable, and that was release it super early. And what I mean by super early was, instead of September 2nd, 1995, they released it on May 11th, 1995. And the really bad thing about that is they didn't tell pretty much anyone, only a few of their retail partners, and most importantly, they didn't tell their third-party game developers who were producing games for the system with the expectation that it was going to be released on September 2nd, 1995, and initially the Saturn was going to be released with 20 titles. And so you can imagine how pretty much pissed off not only the retailers were, but also all the game partners that were going to make games for the Sega Saturn. And whenever the Sega Saturn was released, it was released with 6 games, and they were all done by Sega. It's released with big titles like Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter, Panzer Dragoon, Clockwork Knight, Pebble Beach golf game, and also a World Soccer game. Now, any of these would have been great because they were from Sega, especially with titles like Virtua Fighter and Daytona. But the problem is they didn't have anything else. And by the time the Sony PlayStation was released on fall of 1995, it released with some amazing games, mostly coming from Namco with Ridge Racer and Tekken, which were both arcade perfect and better, but also some newer titles like Battle Arena to Shinden, and many other titles like Jumping Flash and so forth that truly showed the power that the Sony PlayStation were packing and just how far ahead it was when it comes to 3D. And by that time, the Sega Saturn, the games did start coming in. But honestly, it never recovered, mainly because of one thing, and that was this system was rushed. And then also another thing, because it was rushed, I really felt that it always felt incomplete. Even years later, when developers really got familiar with the hardware, it never felt like it was a complete system. And even physically, this just didn't feel like it was a completely well thought out system. It felt really cheap. As a matter of fact, things just were like creaky and really plasticky. I mean, it has this cartridge slot right here. I don't know, it just really felt like it was just off the shelf parts. And that's basically what it was. They just put a whole bunch of different parts in here just to get this working. And then when you compare this to something like the Sony PlayStation, I mean, this is like night and day when it comes to engineering. You could give a lot of props to Ken Kutagari and his team for the engineers that they had, but this was like a really refined piece of artwork compared to this, which is basically a mess. And that's the main reason why I think Sega Saturn failed. Not only was it rushed, it was always an incomplete system, even years and years later. And so whenever you played the Sega Saturn and then you went over to the Sony PlayStation, I kind of felt like this was a different type of generation of game system, because the Sega Saturn, it was still in the whole 2D world. It could do 2D really well. It could also do 3D as well, but nowhere near the capabilities of the Sony PlayStation. I always felt like something was lacking whenever I played a Sega Saturn game. And my thought has always been that with this power that they had, I'm finally going to get some arcade perfect gaming, especially since I love Sega so much. But that never quite happened. Now, there were games like Virtua Fighter 2, Sega Rally, and later on many other titles that really took advantage of the hardware. But even then, I just never felt that way. And also the game system didn't really do anything too much different than what the Sony PlayStation would do. And the PlayStation was bringing a lot of new games that I really enjoyed. And so I always felt like if I wanted the best gaming experience, I'm always going to choose the Sony PlayStation pretty much almost all the time. Obviously, there were some really good titles on the Sega Saturn as well, but they weren't as consistent. And like I said, if I didn't have the Sony PlayStation to compare it to, it wouldn't have mattered. But every time I played the PlayStation, I always felt like I was getting the much better gaming experience. And for people who are really heavy into Sega Saturn, they might disagree with me on that, but that's just my overall opinion. And I really feel, as with a lot of gamers would agree, is that the Sega Saturn wasn't really the game system that Sega wanted. It wasn't the one that gamers wanted as well. What they really wanted was, of course, its successor, which was the Sega Dreamcast. This is absolutely my favorite game system of all time. From any manufacturer. I absolutely love this. And then, you could just compare the difference between these two. I mean, even though they were generations apart, everything on here was everything that the Sega Saturn should have been. If the Sega Saturn had a lot of the same qualities as the Sega Dreamcast, in terms of not only the hardware design and everything else, but also the thinking behind it, the games that were prepared for it, and the support, especially with big game manufacturers, I think it would have had a much better chance with the Sony PlayStation, even up until the Sony PlayStation 2. But obviously that wasn't the case. And now we could always go back to the Sega Saturn, knowing that this one was the one that pretty much ended any hopes that Sega would ever come back from hardware. I really thought that the Sega Dreamcast would do it, but the writing was on the wall. And honestly, you can't really blame anyone except Sega, because they did so many things wrong, in my opinion, after the success of Sega Genesis. They kept releasing add-ons like the Sega CD, the 32X, so many variations of hardware, instead of focusing on the things that they did really well, which was gaming. They should have focused on that, and then, just make sure the hardware is good in order to run their best games and really showcase what Sega is actually offering. And so that is my thoughts on the Sega Saturn and why it failed. If things were different, once again, if it was the Sega Saturn Dreamcast version that came out versus the Sega Saturn version, I think Sega would have had a chance. So those are my final thoughts on that. If you had any of your own thoughts or memories of the Sega Saturn or even the Sony PlayStation or Sega Dreamcast, be sure to leave it in the comments area below. And as always, if you did get value out of these videos, share, like, and subscribe. Hey geeks, if you are a creative geek like me and you wanted to learn how to create content on YouTube and other places on the internet, then check out my Gold Content Creators Group, where you'll get access to 30 videos plus additional content for all the creative geeks out there. And the best part of it is, all of this is free. Simply head over to the link below, check out my page, and sign up for my Gold Content Creators Group. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the other side. Thanks for checking out this episode. And as always, if you like these videos, be sure to click on the subscribe button. And for full written content, audio content, and additional geek stuff, head over to geekoutdoors.com, and I'll see you outdoors on the very next episode.